This is a homily for the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Jesus and his disciples have finally reached Jerusalem, and today's Gospel is set in one of the courtyards of the temple. This final section of Luke's Gospel begins with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the day that we now celebrate as Palm Sunday. It concludes with the Passion narrative, the resurrection of Jesus, and appearances of the risen Lord to some of the disciples. Finally, Jesus leads the disciples out as far as Bethany, and while he blesses them, he is carried up into heaven. As you're aware, the longest section of Luke's Gospel is his account of the journey to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. The Sunday lectionary devotes 19 weeks to what happens on this journey. During Ordinary Time in Year C, the lectionary devotes only 3 weeks to what happens during the last week. The Sunday lectionary's account of the journey to Jerusalem began on week 13 of Ordinary Time, but this year we celebrated instead the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul on that Sunday. The lectionary concludes its account of the journey on the 31st Sunday of Ordinary Time, but this year we had instead the feast of All Souls' Day. The 32nd Sunday of Ordinary Time is the first of 3 Sundays devoted to what happens during the last week. But this year we celebrated instead the dedication of the Lateran Basilica. The Gospel reading for the 31st Sunday of Ordinary Time is the story of Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector who lives in Jericho. In the Gospel for the 32nd Sunday of Ordinary Time, some Sadducees challenge Jesus about the resurrection of the dead, a belief that they reject. So we are now in the final week in the life of Jesus, a week that begins with the triumphal entry into Jerusalem and concludes with the death and resurrection of the Lord. Let's have a quick look at Luke's account of the events of the last week leading up to today's Gospel. Jesus approaches the holy city from the east, coming down from the Mount of Olives. As Jerusalem comes into sight, he shed tears over it, saying, "If you too had only recognized on this day the way to peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For a time is coming when your enemies will raise fortifications all round you, when they will encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you and the children within you to the ground. They will leave not one stone upon another within you, because you did not recognize the moment of your visitation." As we'll see in a moment, Jesus returns to this theme in today's Gospel. Jesus then goes into the temple and begins to drive out traders, saying to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a bandit's den.'" All of chapter 20 is set within the temple. The Jewish leaders question the authority of Jesus. Jesus then tells the people the parable of the wicked tenants. He is then questioned about taxation. Is it permissible to pay taxes to Caesar or not? It is then the turn of the Sadducees, who question Jesus about the resurrection of the dead. Once Jesus has dealt with the Sadducees, he poses a question about David. How can the Christ be the son of David when, in the book of Psalms, David calls him Lord? Finally, Jesus warns the people about the scribes. The setting for chapter 21 is, again, the temple. Jesus is presumably in the courtyard of the women when he sees a poor widow make an offering of 2 small coins, all she had to live on. Then, in response to people who are talking about the temple, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. He then warns about false prophets who will come using his name and saying, "I am the one," and "the time is near at hand." Jesus then alerts his disciples to the warning signs that they must heed, and of the persecution they will endure for the sake of his name. Jesus again talks about the siege of Jerusalem, and then about the coming of the Son of Man and the time of his coming. The disciples must therefore stay awake. Chapter 21 concludes by telling us that during these final days, Jesus spends the night on the Mount of Olives and the day teaching in the temple. So here you can see an overview of the last week up until the end of chapter 21. Today's Gospel, taken from chapter 21, is about the destruction of the temple, a warning about false prophets, the warning signs, and persecution of the disciples. Let's begin with Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple. Notice, by the way, that the verses immediately following today's Gospel are also about the siege of Jerusalem. So in Luke's Gospel, during this final week, Jesus speaks about the destruction of the temple or of the city 3 times. Firstly, as he approaches Jerusalem, and another 2 times as he teaches within the temple. Let's now turn to what Jesus has to say in today's Gospel. We're told that when some were talking about the temple, remarking how it was adorned with fine stonework and votive offerings, Jesus said, "All these things you see, the time will come when not a single stone will be left on another which will not be pulled down." Here you can see what the Jewish temple would have looked like at the time of Jesus. The temple was Bet Yahweh, the house of Yahweh. In Greek, the whole complex was called Hieron. The temple itself, as distinct from its surrounding courtyards, was known as Naos. The Naos consisted of the holy place, which was separated from the Holy of Holies by a curtain. Only priests could enter the holy place, and only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and then on only one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. So unlike a Catholic church, the temple itself was not a place where a congregation gathered for worship. It was the house of God. The altar of sacrifice, located in front of the Naos, was the only place where sacrifice could be offered. For almost 1,000 years, the temple had been the centre of Jewish life. It was the central symbol and institution of Judaism. So let's have a brief look at the temple's history. On Mount Sinai, God gives his law to Moses, written on stone tablets, and they were known as the tablets of the testimony or covenant. These stone tablets were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, which is described in Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 to 32, and chapter 37 verses 1 to 9. The ark was a chest made of acacia wood, covered with gold plates. It had rings attached through which the poles used to carry it were passed. Over the ark was a plate of gold which was the same size as the ark, and it was called the caporet, or mercy seat. 2 cherubim stood at the end of the caporet and covered it with their wings. The ark and the cherubim represented the throne of God. The ark was the visible sign of God's presence. Once the tent had been constructed, we're told in Exodus chapter 40 verses 34 and 35 that the cloud then covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the dwelling. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting, since the cloud stayed over it, and the glory of the Lord filled the dwelling. In Exodus chapters 24 and 25, we find instructions for building the sanctuary, or tabernacle, or tent of meeting. The tabernacle in Hebrew is referred to as Mishkan, which means dwelling or abode. It was a word originally used for the temporary dwelling of a nomad. The Old Testament consistently presents the Mishkan as the literal dwelling place of Yahweh. The Mishkan was divided into the holy place, which was separated by a veil from the Kodosh HaKodoshim, the Holy of Holies, where the ark stood. Once the people had entered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua, they were led for the next 175 years by charismatic leaders, men and women, that the Hebrew Bible calls Shaphat. That is usually translated as judge, but it also includes the idea of ruling and governing. Eventually, the people decided that they wanted a king to rule over them, and God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel in 1030 BC. He is succeeded by David, and David is succeeded by his son Solomon. Under David, the 12 tribes come together in a united kingdom. In the second book of Samuel, chapter 6, we're told that once David had conquered Jerusalem, he brought the ark into the city, with David himself offering sacrifice and dancing before the ark, girt with a linen ephod. David's action in bringing the ark into Jerusalem made this geographically central city not merely his own capital, but God's capital as well. The ark was then placed inside the tent that David had pitched for it. Now that the Lord had granted David peace from all the enemies surrounding him, he says to the prophet Nathan, "Look, I am living in a cedar wood house, while the ark of God is housed in a tent." Nathan then says to the king, "Go and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." But that very night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you to build me a house for me to live in? I have never lived in a house from the day when I brought the Israelites up from Egypt until today, but have kept travelling with a tent for shelter. The Lord also tells you that he will make you a house, and when your days are over, and you fall asleep with your ancestors, I shall appoint your heir, your own son, to succeed you, and I shall make his sovereignty secure. He will build a temple for my name, and I shall make his royal throne secure forever." And so it is David's son Solomon who builds the temple, and it was completed around 950 BC. At the dedication of the temple, Solomon prayed, "I have now built for you a stately house, a place where you may dwell forever." And this gives you an idea of Solomon's temple. So for about 300 years, from the Exodus until Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, the Lord had dwelt among his people in a tent. In the 6th century BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem. He orders the city levelled, and Solomon's temple is razed. Thousands of Jews are taken into exile in Babylon. The Babylonians are in turn conquered by the Persians, who allow the exiles to return home from exile in Babylon. Eventually, they begin the task of rebuilding the temple. It was dedicated in 516 or 515 BC. But in the prophet Haggai, we read that those people who were old enough to remember what Solomon's temple had looked like thought that this second temple was as nothing in comparison. It's not until several hundred years later, during the reign of King Herod, that work began on restoring the temple. It was a decades-long program of construction designed to showcase his piety, rally Judean support for his regime, and immortalize his name. It was finally completed in 63 AD, long after his death. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was writing at about the same time that the Gospels were being written, had this to say about the temple. Now the outward face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes, for it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendour, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. The Talmud says, "He who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building." I've spent some time talking about the history and the centrality of the temple in Jewish life, because it's against that background that we must consider what Jesus tells his disciples in today's Gospel. The disciples must have been absolutely startled when Jesus said, "All these things you see, the time will come when not a single stone will be left on another, which will not be pulled down." He is, of course, foretelling the destruction of the temple by the Romans, which occurred about 40 years later in 70 AD. Even today, 2,000 years later, you can still see some of the stones from the destroyed temple. Recent excavations near the Temple Mount have revealed how the Roman armies in 70 AD used fire to undermine the foundations of the walls, causing huge stones to tumble down into a heap of rubble. In 66 AD, the Jews of Judea revolted against Roman rule. The reasons for the revolt are not entirely clear, but it ended in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. Archaeologists have unearthed more than 70 catapult stones used by the Romans during the siege of the city. These stones weigh about 26 kilograms. They are catapulted at a speed of about 60 kilometres per hour, and they have a range of 300 metres. They were used to devastating effect on the walls of Jerusalem. In this painting, you can see Roman soldiers plundering the temple, carrying off the menorah, the 7-branch candlestick that was located within the holy place in the temple. This is a scene depicted on the Arch of Titus in Rome. The Roman triumph is celebrated on the Arch of Titus in Rome, very close to the Colosseum. Titus was the Roman general leading the campaign, and he eventually became emperor himself in 79 AD. On the inside of the arch, you can see this scene of Roman soldiers carrying booty from the temple, including the menorah. Josephus describes the horror of the temple's destruction. Everywhere was slaughter and flight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar, the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood. Josephus gives the death toll at 1,100,000. He tells us that 97,000 people were carried away into captivity. The Roman historian Tacitus puts the death toll at 600,000. The Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheatre in Rome, celebrated the Roman victory over Judea. The money to build the Colosseum came primarily from the spoils of the Jewish war after the Roman victory in 70 AD. In the Jewish war, Josephus tells us that all the rest of the sacred vessels and the other treasures were carried to Rome. Among the spoils were those taken from the temple, a golden table, many talents in weight, and a lampstand of gold. Moreover, tens of thousands of Jewish captives were taken to Rome, many of whom were used as forced labourers to build the Colosseum and other Roman projects. The Colosseum was begun under the Emperor Vespasian around 72 AD and completed under his son Titus around 80 AD. As we've already seen, Jesus foretells the destruction of Jerusalem 3 times during this final week. Keep in mind that Luke's Gospel was written after the destruction of the temple. So why does Luke remind us of this event 3 times? The first important thing to keep in mind is this. Luke portrays Jesus as a prophet. This means that not only is Jesus God's spokesperson, but he is one who predicts the future. Luke's readers know that the destruction of the temple foretold by Jesus has already come to pass. Luke is therefore subtly telling his readers that just as Jesus' predictions about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple have been fulfilled, so also will his words about the ultimate victory of his disciples. Their endurance will win them their lives. After Jesus has told the disciples about the fate of the temple and the city, they ask when this will happen and what sign there will be that it is about to take place. Jesus warns them about false prophets, people who will use his name saying, "I am he," and "the time is near at hand." Jesus then goes on to say, "Nations will fight against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes and plagues and famines here and there. There will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven." We need to pause here to consider 2 key terms. Firstly, eschatology, and secondly, apocalyptic. Our English word eschatology comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means last. So eschatology refers to teaching or speculation about what is going to happen in the future. More specifically, what will take place in that final future when the whole universe will undergo radical transformation at the hands of God. Apocalyptic comes from the Greek word apokalypto. The prefix apo means away from. It can also be used in the same way as our English prefix un. The verb kalupto means to cover. So the verb apocalypto means to uncover, to reveal or unveil. The noun apocalypsis means an unveiling. Our English word revelation has the same meaning, to roll back the cover or uncover. One of the chief characteristics of apocalyptic discourse is vivid imagery, depicting upheavals and calamities on a cosmic scale, and the conflict between good and evil in a starkly dualistic mode. We certainly have something of that in what Jesus says in today's Gospel. Nation fighting against nation, great earthquakes, plagues, famines here and there, fearful sights and great signs from heaven. Let me pause here for a moment to say a few words about literary genre. Every genre of literature involves an unexpressed contract between the author and his or her readers. Both writer and reader know the rules of this particular game, understanding what is to be expected. So, for example, when a story begins with the words, "Once upon a time," I know that I'm about to hear a fairy tale. A tale that will invariably end with a handsome young prince living happily ever after with his beautiful princess. But in the course of the story, I may well encounter fairies, wizards and witches, fairy godmothers, goblins, dragons and unicorns. The meaning of the story is determined by context. If you change the context, you change the meaning. The literary context is just as important as the historical context. A science fiction novel is not a newspaper article. Aesop wrote fables, not history. Just as there are many different literary genres, so also there are many different genres of art. Consider, for example, the difference between what is referred to as photorealism and the genre known as surrealism. Photorealism seeks to paint reality, in this case an apple that someone has been eating, with such meticulous detail and precision that it resembles a high-resolution photograph. By way of contrast, surrealism sees reality with an inner eye. Here's an example. Salvador Dali's painting named The Persistence of Memory. Is this a scene that Dali ever witnessed, a scene that he could have photographed? Obviously not. Dali is offering us a reflection on the nature of reality. This painting is a meditation on time, on change and decay. Notice the melting watches and ants swarming over one of the watches, implying decay. This scene is reality as seen not by a camera, but by an inner eye. Pablo Picasso once said that art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. The point that I'm making here is that the apocalyptic language used in today's gospel is not the literary equivalent of photorealism. In other words, it would be a mistake to search the historical records in an attempt to discover which nation, just prior to 70 AD, was rising up against which nation, and which kingdom was rising up against which kingdom. Likewise, we misunderstand the nature of apocalyptic writing if we attempted to find out precisely where any earthquakes, plagues and famines had occurred in the lead up to 70 AD. So if we strip away the apocalyptic imagery, what spiritual truths lie beneath this text? In today's gospel, Jesus uses apocalyptic language to warn his disciples that they will encounter turbulent times because of their allegiance to him. They will hand you over to imprisonment and bring you before kings and governors because of my name. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relations and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Keep in mind that the Acts of the Apostles is part 2 of Luke's Gospel, although it doesn't follow immediately after the Gospel in the New Testament. The fulfillment of these prophecies of Jesus about persecution is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. During the 50s and 60s, prior to the destruction of the temple, disciples of Jesus were seized, persecuted, handed over to synagogues and prisons, led before kings and governors, and some were put to death. But here we have the message of today's gospel. In this time of great trial, the disciples are not to lose hope. And why? Because Jesus will give them an eloquence and a wisdom that none of their opponents will be able to resist or contradict. Before the final coming of the Son of Man, there is a long journey to be faced. It will be marked by suffering and persecution, but it will also be marked by the loving and guiding presence of a faithful God. Jesus assures his disciples, "Not a hair of your head will be lost. Victory will be yours in the final triumph of God."